Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is our class for Monday, May 6th, which happens to be our last class before the final exam on Wednesday. So I wanted to put some closure onto poetry. Last class, I had you listen to two different audios of Allen Ginsberg's reading of America. They're both very different. One was a live reading in front of a Berkeley audience. Berkeley was where he taught English. Obviously, a very supportive audience, and it's a reading of his draft. And if you read along, you could see that the draft is different from the final published version. And I had you also listen to an audio of the final published version that he did in a studio without a live audience. You can definitely see that there's a sense of seriousness to the second reading that wasn't there with the first reading. And I wanted to give you an example of beat poetry, which is obviously defiant, obviously unconventional, very stream of consciousness. So sometimes it's very difficult to follow because it's following thought patterns. So it's deliberately unclear. And there are also lots of topical references that may not necessarily have the most relevance to you, at least at this point in time. But for Ginsberg's audience, it would have made a lot of sense. And I often liken it to what you might hear with a late night comedian give in his or her monologue, where at the time it's quite funny or quite relevant because it's recent, but we tend to have short memory. So even a few weeks later, it may not seem that recent. But that said, I can tell you that the references he makes are usually to injustices. And I just wanted to read a few lines of the poem where he begins by saying, "America, I've given you all and now I'm nothing." You know, the idea that I've sacrificed everything for the country and what have I gotten back? And the second line is a suggestion of what he's gotten back: $2.27, January 17, 1956. Or perhaps that's how much he has in his bank account, or how much he has in his pocket, or that perhaps that's how much something of importance to him costs. Lots of references to sanity and insanity. He says he can't stay in his own mind. Should tell you that Ginsberg literally was in and out of mental institutions. One of the major questions of the poem is that who exactly is sane or insane? Perhaps those in the insane asylums are the most sane. The idea of human war, and of course, go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. So deliberately jarring, particularly when we think about the early days of poetry. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Of course, atom bombs are phallic as well, so the F word seems to also be a suggestion of sexuality as well as destruction. I won't write my poem till I'm in my right mind. Now, he's written his poem, so perhaps he is in his right mind. Asking when America will be angelic and take off its clothes to show the truth rather than, hide behind its false patriotism. In other words, when will you look at yourself through the grave? And why are your libraries full of tears, which is where the truth is in the libraries of real history? When can I go to the supermarket and buy what I need with my good looks? And think about how important appearances, especially in our time period with social media, but the idea of the superficiality of America. And lots of references to the mechanization of society, taking away humanity. Your machinery is too much for me. He says there must be some other way to settle this argument. He's challenging us as a reader. Prove me wrong and offer a solution. Now, you might think that that is somewhat self-indulgent because he himself doesn't offer a solution. Though at one point he admits that he himself is America. So he's part of the problem. And he asks, is this some sort of practical joke? I'm trying to come to the point. And I haven't read the newspapers for months. Every day somebody goes on trial for murder. And it seems very contemporary, that particular line. Oftentimes talking about communism at a time when that was very dangerous to do. Talking about smoking marijuana when, again, marijuana was also illegal at the time period. And reading Karl Marx, again known for the Communist Manifesto. refusing to say the Lord's Prayer. In other words, basically questioning all of the sacred institutions of America. When he says, I have mystical visions and cosmic vibrations, he's quite literal there. And if you think about the time period, and this in many ways was a prelude to the drug culture of the 1960s. And he asks, I'm addressing you. Are you going to let your life be run by Time Magazine? If I were going to update this, perhaps I would substitute Time Magazine with TikTok. But the idea that the media is ultimately influencing our opinions and our ability or inability to think. And he talks about how he is in the basement of the Berkeley Public Library, and that would probably be quite accurate because he was a professor at Berkeley, and that, at least according to the media, it talks about responsibility and that businessmen are serious and movie producers are serious, but he's not. Or perhaps he's a serious one and they're not because all they care about is money. Well, Ginsburg is arguing for justice. But he does say, it occurs to me that I'm America, that I am America, but I'm talking to myself again. In other words, is anybody listening? And then he talks about some of the great fears of the other of America. China is rising against me. He talks a little bit about how he has an ambition to be president despite the fact that I'm Catholic, which would have been quite humorous at the time because only John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic and only Catholic president at that point. How can I write a holy litany in your silly mood? In other words, how can you expect me to write something beautiful when I suggest that America is not beautiful? And he talks about how he's like Henry Strophes, or Henry Ford, and that his strophes are as individual as his automobiles. That's a little pun. The idea of Greek chorus is that a strophe is a unified movement that everyone in the chorus is making. In other words, we're all doing the same thing. And he's talking about freeing Tom Mooney and Spanish loyalists, and that he's the Scottsboro Boys. Again, these are people who have experienced injustices during his time period, at least according to his perspective. The poem even collapses at one point. It doesn't look like a poem. It looks like a piece of prose, where he was talking about being at a communist cell meeting. And then he talks again about another, quote, enemy, unquote, of America, the Russians, even mimicking second language patterns, saying that she wants to take our cars from out of our garages, and the idea of the communist desire to destroy our capitalistic achievements. He uses the N-word. In other words, there's just about something for everybody to be offended about in this poem. And I've seen two extremes with beat poetry, either the people that hate beat poetry because it is self-indulgent and it is ugly and even offensive. And then the people who love beat poetry because it's a poetry of truth in its unvarnished nature. He does say that this is the impression I get from looking at the TV set. Again, reference to the media. Is this correct? And he says he doesn't want to join the military or turn lathes and precision parts factories. And when he says, I'm putting my queer shoulder to the wheel, he means that literally in some respects, because he was very open about being queer at a time when you wouldn't do that. So there's a lot here in this poem to unpack if you wanted to go through it line by line. And, you know, the irony that his psychoanalyst thinks that he's perfectly right. And again, much like stream of consciousness, we can't know exactly what some of these references are, but we certainly get a sense of the tone of anger and defiance and also pleading. Obviously, we see a huge shift from what we started with at the beginning of the poetry section. So what's left are two poems. One poem that I had assigned by Martin Espada, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. Martin Espada is local. He is an English professor at UMass Amherst, and he oftentimes does readings locally, including at GCC and in the Lava Center in downtown Greenfield. This happens to be one of my favorite poems of his because he's able to make commentary about his Puerto Rican and American heritage and how they're both similar but also quite different from one another. I myself am Puerto Rican. I was born in the United States, however. And Martin Espada talks a little bit about his first visit to Puerto Rico, where he basically went as a kind of tourist because he had spent his life, much like I'd spent my life, in New York. For him, it would be Brooklyn, and for me, it would be the Bronx. And on his first visit to Puerto Rico, which means rich port, by the way, in Spanish, the island of family folklore, he references a fat boy, which would be him. He says this poem was autobiographical, but also it's a symbol for America, which is fat. Wandering from table to table, basically looking for nourishment. In other words, he's looking for something to satisfy his hunger. But it's not a hunger for food, it's a hunger for cultural heritage, as we find out. And at every table, some great aunt would steer him with cool spotted hands. In other words, this is the older generation. 2 glasses of Coca-Cola, which is probably the most well-known symbol globally from a commercial perspective. And one sanctum in all the English she could remember. Keep in mind that the primary language of Puerto Rico is Spanish, secondary is English. Puerto Rico is it is part of the United States, yet not part of the United States. And actually, if you were to, it's a colony. And if you were to listen to the brief audio, which I would like you to do, that I've included below in our notes, of Martin Espada reading his poem, he talks a little bit about that before he actually reads it. And that he wasn't looking for Coca-Cola. That basically represented his time in Brooklyn. What he was looking for was his cultural heritage, which he finds at a beach at a stand where you can have a coco frio, which is a coconut chilled and then scalped by a machete, where he inhales the clear milk. And a coco frio is the exact opposite of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is artificial. Coco frio is natural. Coca-Cola is bad for you nutritionally. Coco frio is good for you nutritionally. A roadside stand is as local as you're going to get, as opposed to Coca-Cola, which has become basically a global corporation. We can continue to make parallels between the distinctions of the two. And the idea of milk is supposed to bring forth images of motherland and the idea of motherhood. The boy tilted the green shell. The shell is green because it's really that fresh. And drooled coconut milk down his chin. That's how hungry he is for his culture again. And suddenly in Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola. And keep in mind that New York is also an island like Puerto Rico, even though people don't think of New York as an island. And for years afterwards, the boy marveled at an island where people drank Coca-Cola, that being Puerto Rico, and sang jingles from World War II. They'd become completely assimilated in some respects. In a language they did not speak, while so many coconuts in the trees sagged heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. Not taking appreciation or not taking advantage of your own cultural heritage and the abundances that surround you, which might be true of all of us in some respects, that we take for granted that which happens to be readily available. And again, the idea of swollen and unsuckled should bring forth the idea of breasts and motherhood and suckling. And that's it. That leaves us with one final poem. So after you've listened to the audio of Martin Espada reading Coca-Cola and Coco Frio, you'll see that the final poem we have is from 2021. And you may or may not have been alive when Coca-Cola and Coco Frio was written in the early 90s. But we all were alive in 2021. And it seems like yesterday, even though we are approaching 4 years. And it was a very tense time, the inauguration, where it was possible that for the first time in United States history, we would not have a peaceful transfer of power. You remember that the January 6th insurrection had happened shortly beforehand. And Amanda Gorman happened to be the youngest poet ever to present at a presidential inauguration. ended up delivering this particular poem. She was 21 years old at the time. This was President Biden's 2021 swearing in ceremony. And the way that I first heard this poem, as most of America first heard this poem, was through her reading in the presidential inauguration. She wrote it specifically for the inauguration. She wrote it after January 6th, which goes to show how incredibly talented she was, that in such a short time that she could write this incredible poem. And obviously, there's lots of punning on the idea of climbing a hill, and not just in terms of doing something that's difficult, but of course, the insurrection happened on Capitol Hill. And that said, I wanted you to watch her performance. I've also included a link where you can read the poem. Again, at the time, just about everybody had experienced it first orally without having read it first. I do remember my own reactions when listening to her read that poem. It gave me goosebumps, and I remember going onto social media immediately afterwards and saying, I've just seen the future of poetry, and her name is Amanda Gorman. An incredible talent. And sometimes with poetry, it's best to just experience and not necessarily analyze, especially because this is a poem that we all have a connection with, in that we all lived through this time period in a way that we may not have a connection with any of the other poems, and in a way that readers and viewers may not have 30 years from now or even 20 years from now. But we, of course, understand the climate of the times in which this poem was delivered. And as she's there wearing her bright yellow outfit as a symbol of optimism, underneath it, she's wearing a bulletproof shield. They were all wearing bulletproof shields. The assumption was that an assassination attempt would be highly likely. And luckily, that did not happen. And luckily, there was indeed a peaceful transfer of power. But I'm going to end the semester with that poem, The Hill We Climb. And I encourage you to not only watch her performance, because it is a performance very much in and of itself, but it's to think about her words very carefully as we approach yet another presidential election, which should mean another inauguration. And in terms of where that leaves us for the semester, that would be the final examination. So the final, as you know, is going to be on Wednesday, and I will post it at the time our class would normally meet, 10:30 a.m. If we were meeting in person, you would have 2 hours or so to take that final. Because we are not meeting in person, obviously, you have 24 hours, though I don't expect you to spend more than about 2 hours or so on that examination, which will be open book, open notes, series of essay questions, mostly devoted to poetry, 80 points, but you'll have 10 points short story, 10 points drama. And because it's open book, open notes, you can access things like our class notes and the discussion forum responses as well. So again, I'll be posting the final exam on Wednesday, the 8th at 10:30 a.m., and that'll be due 24 hours later on the 9th, which is Thursday, 10:30 a.m. Wednesday, the 8th, is the last day in which you could hand in any outstanding assignments. So if you still have not submitted in paper number 2, or you still have not submitted in a revision and you would like to do so, make sure you've got that in by the 8th at 10:30 a.m. And that's done deliberately so that you can focus completely on the final examination, and then you are done with the class. And final grades will be available, should be available by the 16th on MyGCC, but if your grade is not available on MyGCC by the 16th, please contact me, and I will happy to provide you with your grade. And I have a farewell message for you from a friend of mine that happens to be in the 5th section in the notes below. So you can click on that. It's about 30 seconds or so to give you a little farewell for the class. And there is no attendance question because basically you've got a final exam to take on Wednesday. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And We will continue on with the final examination on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.